Samantha fights for her life against James, while Bray's presence suggests a deeper conspiracy. Can Samantha uncover Bray's true plans and escape his grasp in this struggle? How will she confront Raven's betrayal and Bray's challenge to Samuel? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 15 And the Night We Live. The sound of a car door shutting awoke me. A moment later, Samuel appeared at my side with a guilty expression. I didn't mean to wake you. I rubbed my eyes and blinked away the last of my sleep. The trip to the funeral site had taken longer than expected, and since I wouldn't be sleeping for the foreseeable future, a well-deserved nap had taken up the entire journey. You would have had to wake me up eventually, I yawned. I'm not a talented sleepwalker. Samuel laughed. I would have carried you, Samantha. Right, I scoffed. I've got 2 legs that work perfectly fine for the time being, and I intend to use them. He rolled his eyes and helped me out of the car, shutting the door softly behind me. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness surrounding us, but what I saw still left me confused. Where are we? Samuel took my hand and began walking forward with me in tow. Just outside the clearing. There's nowhere to put the car once we're there. Makes sense, I nodded. His voice dropped below a whisper and he glanced down at me. Are you ready to show the pack how close to death you've become? I laughed once and let my body fall limp against Samuel. It's getting hard to walk. I actually don't think my legs work anymore. I felt his chuckle rather than hearing it. With my weight leaning against him, his body shook in time with his silent laughter. Instead of saying anything after that, Samuel adjusted his arms so that he was holding up my waist and supporting most of my weight. The 2 of us walked that way through the forest. The further we hiked, the denser the forest became. I knew it would clear eventually, as Samuel had explained in great detail what to expect out of tonight. Still, as the trees began to grow sporadic, I wasn't prepared for the sight ahead of me. The clearing was unlike any I'd encountered before. Forested woods stretched around the perimeter with gentle rolling hills in every direction. There was one particular hill that broke away from the forest and had been cleared of any trees or obstacles. It seemed to go on forever, blending in with the horizon as the shining sky enveloped the ground in a welcome embrace. People of all ages were scattered around the clearing. They grouped together, speaking in hushed tones. Each of them was clothed similarly to Samuel and me, dresses and suits all in the pack's signature red color. Though many tried to hide it, they watched as Samuel and I broke through the treeline to join the crowd. I tried to ignore their pointed and scrutinizing stares, sinking further into Samuel. In the middle of the clearing was a bonfire larger than life itself. Wood was stacked high with countless platform-like structures atop each pile. On each platform was an intricately carved box large enough to hold the bodies of those who passed. Samuel had explained to me that these caskets were specially designed by each of the families who had lost someone. Each was unique to the person they held. The night before, after Samuel had finished explaining what I should expect of the funeral, I was taken aback. It all seemed like a garish affair that was too much trouble for what it was worth. However, witnessing it in person was different than having it described. It wasn't a gruesome or harrowing sight to see caskets burning in the fire like I'd thought it would be. It was beautiful. The hushed voices of everyone in the clearing set the tone for reverence. The moon above gave a gentle light the fire could not provide. Trees and forest around the clearing made it seem as if the rest of the world didn't exist. It was only those who'd passed away, and those who came to celebrate their lives. Samuel paused while walking forward, glancing at me from the side of his eye. I took the cue to stop, take a struggling breath, and wince. Several pairs of eyes flashed to us, but I kept my gaze averted. Samuel acknowledged the others as we continued walking again, nodding his head to any person who bothered to keep staring. He'd also warned me of this. The pack is curious about me. They can't help but stare. Of course, his warnings didn't make it any more comfortable. Once we'd almost reached the fire, we stopped again and I took another deep breath. This one was more for my sake than anyone else's. Despite being plastered to Samuel's side with him practically holding me up, I was overwhelmed and intimidated. I was facing an entire pack of werewolves, all of whom were sizing me up as their newest addition. Each one of them had a different reaction. Some of them regarded me with disinterest, others with disgust. There were a few who shared looks of pity, and even fewer that shone with excitement. Samuel never introduced me to any of them, As they all were told that I was struggling to stay alive and couldn't hold much of a conversation, that was all the better for me. I didn't particularly want to hold an extensive discussion with what looked like hundreds of wolves. "How are you feeling?" Samuel's voice cut into my ears. I glanced up at him before coughing, a shiver running down my spine. "Fine." A corner of his mouth quirked up, only enough for me to see. We were close enough now that the firelight was flashing on his face. When his eyes were illuminated, I tried to hold back a gasp. They were changing colors, going from obsidian blue to bright red with each passing moment. "Samantha," he mumbled, breaking me from my stare. When I looked away, I noticed he had placed us in the center of the clearing, right next to the heart of the fire. I knew what was coming next, and by the way my heart began beating out of my chest, I wasn't ready for it. Samuel looked me up and down, smirked, then turned toward the crowd that had begun to gather in front of us. Despite the number of people packed into the clearing, the night was quiet. A breath of a whisper would escape here and there, but for the most part, Samuel held the entire pack's attention. I recognized a few faces spread throughout the sea of strangers, taking comfort when I met the gazes of Raven, Marshall, or even Goldie. When my eyes fell upon Peyton Bray, I tried not to flinch away. He was already watching me, a sharp glint lighting up his eyes. It was as if he too could sense my discomfort, and only relished in it. Like a ghost from my past, his words from the other night rang through my ears, and I found myself trying to back away from Samuel. He held me at his side though, refusing to let me out of his grasp. As if knowing his actions might cause me to panic, Samuel slipped his fingers into mine and gave me a gentle squeeze. His small comforting act brought me back to reality, and for the next few moments I forgot about Peyton completely. When the movement in the crowd ceased, Samuel cleared his throat and raised his voice to travel through the night. Tonight is a night that many of us thought would never come. We go through our lives tending to forget how fragile they actually are. It shouldn't take nights like these to remind us, but we are here nonetheless. I will not tell you that tonight is not the time to mourn. I will not tell you to hold back your tears and celebrate. We have suffered a significant loss from our family as a pack. Fathers, brothers, mothers, sisters have all been lost. The only comfort we can take is knowing they are not gone forever. Samuel let his words sink into the crowd, glancing down at me before he continued. His voice was thick with sorrow, but he never let an emotion crack his face. "I will tell you that tonight is the night we live. Let us forget everything else and focus on what is here right now. Let us live with all we have left. Together." Samuel turned from the crowd to face the fire, taking me with him. The people moved behind us as one, each taking their respective place next to the scorching flames that now seemed to take up the entire clearing. There were countless caskets within the fire, each of varying sizes. Every spot around the fire was taken up by those who came to pay their respects and be with those they'd lost. There wasn't enough room for everyone, but the crowd constantly shifted to allow each person a glance of the ashes. As the crowd shuffled their feet and whispered to one another, Samuel looked at me once again. There was pain in his eyes, a pain so old that I felt only I knew the source. Still, when he spoke, his voice never wavered. "Your mother's in there." My breathing stopped and my eyes grew wide. I gaped at Samuel, any words that wanted to leave my mouth getting lost in the final explosion of my heart. Next to Riley, he continued. "In the center. It's reserved for those who deserved the highest respect." My eyes traveled back to the flames, landing on two boxes that were dead center. They'd already been engulfed in the fire, but their position remained true. My lips parted as I fought the mess of thoughts swarming my mind. "I don't know what to say, Samuel." How and I trailed off, staring at the casket I now knew belonged to my mother. "You don't have to say anything. You lost someone too." The words died on my lips as I turned my full attention to what was in front of me. All thoughts melted away from my mind until the only thing I could feel was the memories of my mother, alive in the flames. To say the fire danced would be doing it an injustice. The fire was alive. It soared. It leaped. It sparked higher into the sky than anything dared to before. The flames played and swirled around each other, fighting to be seen. When the fight was over, they would join and finish their existence together. No longer content to be alone, they sprawled outward, reaching their fingertips to those lingering close by, threatening to sting. Their flaming tongues never did any harm, though. The moment they reached skin, the sparks retreated, as if it were those watching the flames who promised to burn. Samuel pulled me closer and stretched his hand into mine, twisting our fingers just as the flames. We watched together for what felt like an eternity, lost to anything else happening in the world. Our faces stared into the growing ashes, the heightening sparks, reliving every moment of our lives with those we'd lost. There were soft murmurs around us of people doing the same, eyes haunted with what had been stolen away. As the minutes flew by, the sparks grew higher. They sailed into the sky until they joined the stars. The fire was taking more control now, and everyone was letting it. We gave the flames a wide berth, turning our attention upward to watch the sparks of loved ones disappear into the atmosphere. Then, as if on instinct, the eyes of the crowd turned to the hills. The majority of the fire sparks were traveling up the green mountains now, hungering for the freedom of the woods. One by one, people from the crowd began to join them. Men and women knelt down to the ground, morphed into creatures, and followed the flames into the night. Wolves of all shapes and sizes ran and tumbled alongside the dimming sparks, breathing in the last of the fire's light. The goal was no longer to reminisce but to live with those who'd passed one last time. Samuel turned to me. The fire glowed in his burning red eyes, but I felt no fear. I was closer to Samuel than ever before. "It's time," he whispered, our faces inches apart. I nodded my head, but I couldn't bring myself to pry my hands from his. "You should be with them. The night calls for us to be with those we love." I scanned the outskirts of the forest, watching as several more groups left to run the hills together. "Then I guess it really is time for me to leave. That's what you want. It's for the best." He shook his head once, never breaking his gaze from mine. His mouth hung open with his next words, and even before he spoke, I knew what he was going to say. "I love you, Samantha." Before I could react, Samuel took my hands in his and placed a soft kiss on my knuckles. His eyes closed and his face crumpled. He lingered there until the world stopped turning. My heart was beating out of my chest, but I never drew away from him. I never once thought to. As quickly as it happened, Samuel withdrew from me. He dropped my hands and took a pained step away, his head falling to his chest. My hands were left suspended in the air, waiting for him to take them back. He never did. Samuel turned away from me and bent low to the ground. The next time I blinked, his blonde wolf was standing in his place, staring longingly at the space between us. I took half a step toward him, but the wolf flinched and began to back away. Before I could utter a word, he turned and sprinted into the forested hills. My heart left with him. I was left standing in the clearing, almost completely alone now. The last of the wolves were shifting and joining their pack in the hills to run with their lost ones the rest of the night. However, I was just now realizing that my lost ones weren't all in the flames. One of them was running beneath. Something brushed up against my hand and I flinched away. When I whirled to face the culprit, Raven was staring at me with sad eyes. "It's time to go." Though numbness was taking over, I nodded. When Raven reached out again, I didn't recoil. She brought her hands up to my face to wipe tears I never knew had fallen. "Sometimes it's for the best," she told me under her breath. "Sometimes we make sacrifices for what we truly want." My voice came out as nothing more than a whisper. "Is this what I truly want?" Raven's lips thinned and she stared at me for several long moments. She searched my eyes for the answer I desired, but in the end, fluttered her gaze away. "Will is ready to leave. He's just waiting in the car." Instead of answering her, my eyes went back to the forest. If I looked hard enough, I could see the remnants of Samuel's wolf leading his pack through the hills. My heart tore into pieces once more as I realized I could never be with him. He was meant to lead his kind, I was meant to escape them. I should never have entertained the thought of tolerating him. Raven's voice met my ears again, but I barely heard her. "I'll wait with Will in the car. Come when you're ready." She disappeared into the night, leaving me alone once again. The clearing was completely empty now, and the fire didn't seem as radiant as before. Though the flames were burning higher than ever, they were cold and lifeless. I stared into them, waiting to feel the warmth I had felt when Samuel was by my side, but it never came. Chapter 60. Shoulda known the drive was long. I never kept track of how much time passed, but each minute felt like an eternity. With every breath I took, It seemed another 1,000 trees disappeared behind the car. And another 100 miles was placed between me and Samuel. Raven was driving. She hadn't spoken a word since I clambered into the front seat. Will was sprawled across the back of the car, taking turns napping and staring out the window. He tried making conversation, but those attempts soon died off. It was dark. The car was musty and I was suffocating. I wanted nothing more than to open a window, but Raven told me our scent would travel. We were in an abandoned car that the pack had stored for years, so unless we did something drastic or opened a window, the old smell would overtake our own and we were untraceable. We're coming up on the border. Raven broke the never-ending silence with a hushed voice. Will perked up in the back seat, placing himself between Raven and me. That didn't take long. I took a deep breath, refusing to look at the clock. Time wasn't cooperating with my mind tonight. How long? Any minute now. Raven paused. There shouldn't be anyone there. If there is, they should be with Samuel. Will and I nodded, but he spoke the question lingering in the air. And if they're not? Raven remained silent. Will waited for a moment, then looked at me with wide eyes. I gave him a small reassuring smile, turning my gaze to look out the front window. Don't worry, Will. I've escaped before. It wasn't that hard. They still caught you eventually, he mumbled. I resisted the urge to scowl and looked more earnestly at the path before us. We'd taken the least used route possible, in order to exit the packland in the weakest spot. Already I could see that the road was barely there, and the trees were overgrowing into the path. When a fence eventually appeared on the horizon, it was rusted and bent. Do you see anything? I asked Raven. Her eyes were trained on a spot beyond the fence, but she shook her head. Nothing. I couldn't help my heart as it tensed and began to beat faster. The last time I'd escaped it had been almost too easy. This time seemed strikingly similar. Unlike last time though, my heart wasn't stretching forward into the unknown, yearning for the freedom of the woods. It wasn't feeling at all. There had been no time to process my goodbye with Samuel, his parting words, or how I felt about any of it. I guess there would be time for that when we truly escaped, but a small part of me feared the feelings would be lost by then. The car slowed as we drew closer to the fence. Raven parked the car in front of a dilapidated gate, long abandoned of any patrol. When the car stood still, the three of us did the same. We each knew what needed to happen next, but none of us wanted to leave the safety of our metal box. Eventually, Raven cleared her throat. I'll be back, I guess. If anything happens, you know what to do. Before we could respond, she opened the door and crept into the night. She disappeared into the darkness, blending with the shadows until she came upon the fence. I was just able to see her at the entrance, tugging at the lock and gate until they gave way. The minute the chain was loose and the gate opened, Raven darted back to the car. When she sat in the driver's seat and closed the door, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The three of us sat still for another moment, smiling and laughing our way through the tension. Our laughter was cut off as soon as it began. A deafening crashing echoed through the night. Our gazes whipped to the fence just in time to see the gate rattling shut. It wasn't locked, but the once open entrance had now been closed off. When the sound of the gate shutting died off, the only thing to be heard was the heavy breathing of everyone in the car. None of us dared to speak, move, or turn away from what had just happened. That all changed when something smashed into the side of the car. My startled scream rang through the night, prompting another push at the vehicle in the very spot Will was sitting. He sprang from his seat, throwing himself to the other end of the car the same moment I took the keys from Raven's hands and shoved them into the ignition. Go! I screamed at her as the back of the car was hit, propelling us forward. Raven fumbled for a moment before slamming on the gas, barreling the car straight through the crumbling fence. The large car easily pushed over the metal, but the assaults against us refused to cease. As soon as we cleared the fence, something heavy came down on the top of the car, plunging the roof down on our heads. This time Raven's screams echoed my own. The car swerved when something appeared in the road ahead of us. Raven tried to gain control as we were hit from the side, but the momentum was too much. We collided with the trees. My vision went dark and all I could hear was the crunching of metal and snapping of wood. By the time we stopped moving, my head was spinning and my ears ringing. There was darkness all around. I strained to hear past the ringing to listen for the sounds of Raven or my brother, but there was nothing there. Nothing until I was propelled from my seat and lifted into overpowering arms. I fought against their grasp, and as soon as I did, they let me go. I blinked several times, forcing my eyes to adjust to my surroundings. The first thing that came into focus was Will's eyes, staring wide into my own. The next was the blood running down his face. He was cupping my jaw, moving his lips with words I still couldn't hear. When his gaze darted behind him, I realized we were sitting outside the crumpled and smoking car. Raven was a little ways off, holding her head and leaning against a broken tree. Behind her a figure lingered. Garbled speech left my lips as I reached out to warn her. Will whipped around to face where I was staring, but he wasn't quick enough. The figure reached out and took hold of Raven's arm, pulling her into the shadows. All at once my senses came crashing down on me. The pain in my head, the lingering echoes of screams, the thick smell of smoke, liquid running down my face. Samantha! Will pulled my attention back to him, screaming my name. My breathing quickened as trembling hands searched for his. He took hold of my wrists and lifted me off the ground, leaving the car to our backs. We both scanned the forest around us, straining to hear anything other than our own panicked minds. Well, I whispered, what's going on? Where are they? He moved his hands to grip my shoulders, holding my swaying body in place. I don't know. I don't know what happened. Can you stand? Are you hurt? I chanced, shuffling my feet, finding my balance growing steadier by the second. I think so, and no, I'm fine. I gasped then, catching a look at my brother. Will, you're bleeding. He cut me off and wiped a hand down his face, shaking his head. I'm okay. Whatever it was is healed. His eyes narrowed as he looked at a spot near my temple. Without warning, he reached forward and ripped off my sleeve, folding it into a makeshift cloth. Hold this against your head. It should slow any bleeding. Will made sure I did as he said before he turned around and headed for the car. He dug through the shattered glass and broken metal for a moment, re-emerging with one of our bags. He slipped it onto his back, scanning our surroundings. When the only thing that greeted us was darkness, his face fell. Did you see who it was? I shook my head. No. He nodded once and pulled something out of the bag, placing it in his pocket. Then he pulled out a heavy pouch, holding it out to me. I didn't have to ask what it was, to know it was the gun Samuel promised us for the journey. I took it with trembling hands, tucking it into my jeans. Will stood by my side, and each of us watched the forest with bated breath. As silence enveloped us, dread fell heavy on my shoulders. It seemed to fill every space around us, molding with the air we breathed. Something was watching us. Something was waiting for us. Something didn't want us to leave. A quick glance at the car and I knew there was no way we could get back inside to drive away. Broken glass littered the seats, the doors were pushed against each other, and the tires were no longer facing the right direction. Another scan of the forest let me know that there was no way we could make a run for it either. There was no marked path. The sky wasn't visible from underneath the thick trees. Even if we could navigate our way through the maze of foliage, we wouldn't last a day without our supplies, which were somewhere buried beneath the wreckage of the car. The only way out would be to fight for our lives. My gaze darted up to Will, who seemed to be realizing everything in time with me. He glanced back at me, and I could see the panic leaking into his features. His wide eyes were all I needed to take a deep breath and let my voice ring out into the night. Who are you and what do you want? We were met with silence. Long, painful silence. When it grew to be too much, I took a step forward, holding Will beside me. He mimicked my actions as I took another step, further away from the car. We walked several feet before we stopped dead in our tracks. A voice had cleared behind us, a voice we both knew too well. I wouldn't go any farther. We whirled around, only to come face to face with the eyes that haunted my dreams. My voice trembled. James. We should have known, Will spat, pushing me behind him. A triumphant smile shone from under his unkempt beard. Yeah, I guess you should have. For once, James' words weren't slurred. They were articulate and clear, laced with an underlying menace. You should have known a lot of things. I was suddenly ripped away from Will, tight hands squeezing my waist as they dragged me back. A startled scream tore through me, but the moment Will reached for my hand, he was thrown to the ground by James. My hands grappled with those around my waist as I twisted and turned, fighting off whoever held me. I kicked and lashed out, but my limbs never met anyone to maim. Stop moving or your brother's dead. My body stilled. My heart raced. The only thing I could process was the image of James holding Will's head in his arms, ready to twist at any given moment. He smiled. Good. Raven dear, let her go now. Hands let go of my waist. The world stopped turning. I stayed frozen on the forest floor, refusing to look behind me to confirm the end of all hope. Come and hold the boy. Feet moved from behind me, slow and heavy. I watched them creep toward James and my brother, stopping when Will was handed over. Only then did my gaze travel upward to stare into the eyes of the one person I thought was my friend. Raven's gaze was on the ground, but her arms were restraining Will. He fought against her, but she was much stronger than he. It took only a minimal effort for her to pin his arms and shoulders down. Well, that's not a happy face, James mused as he began his slow walk toward me. I scurried off the ground, lifting myself up to my full height. He still towered over me, but my attention wasn't on James. My gaze was trained on Raven. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I couldn't have missed something like this. Raven. My voice was nothing but a whisper. Raven, what are you doing? What's going on? She turned her head away from me, continuing to stare at the ground. James sauntered toward me without a care in the world. As he drew nearer, my hands went to the pouch tucked in my jeans. He watched my movements with annoyed eyes. If you take that out, he'll die. My hands froze. James smiled. Here's what you're going to do. Put one hand in the air, and with your other, take out your weapon and drop it on the ground. My mind was racing faster than my heart. Keeping my gaze on Will, I raised one hand and let the other fall to my jeans. I hesitated for just a moment, holding my breath as I withdrew the weapon from the pouch. The next moment, I had it pulled out and pointed at James' head. His eyes widened and he raised both his hands. Behind him, Will laughed. You didn't think that one through, did you, pal? James' expression darkened and he half turned toward Will. You best not test me. One word and your neck is snapped. No. I stepped forward and James shot his attention back toward me. One word and this bullet goes through your head. You wouldn't want to do that, Samantha dear. My eyes narrowed. Actually, I think I would. I cocked the gun. Samuel showed me how to use it and I was well aware of how to shoot. Though my hand trembled and my heart beat out of my ears, my grip of the weapon was unmoving. My finger hovered over the trigger, ready to pull. Wait, James rushed out, voice harsh. Don't you want to know? Know what? I growled. How your dear mother died. The one thing that could have caused my composure to slip came crashing out of James' lips. I stopped breathing as a knowing smirk encompassed his features. I wish I could say it was an accident, he began. But it wasn't. Business is business, as they all say. I don't know much about that, but I do know it wasn't pretty. Stop. Will shouted, his yell shattering the trees. Samantha, shoot him. His voice was silenced when Raven wound her arms around his neck, cutting off his air supply. Not another second passed before James lunged forward. He was upon me before I knew what was happening. The gun was thrown out of my hands and I was pinned to the ground by his heavy legs atop my arms. I thrashed underneath him, tearing at any piece of skin I could get a hold of. No more running now, girl, James snarled. As he spoke, his teeth elongated and face morphed into a twisted combination of man and beast. He sunk his face down upon my shoulder, teasing my flesh with his pointed canines. It's over. There was no hesitation before he bit into my neck. I screamed louder than I ever thought possible, fighting him with every ounce of strength I had left. Despite the overwhelming pain, I pushed against James' face, ripping him away from my shoulder. He pulled back and smiled before shifting his knees to pin down my elbows. His hand covered my mouth, muffling my cries. A sick snarl sounded through my ears, just as James descended upon me to finish my life. However, it wasn't from James that the snarl erupted. It was a foreign sound, one that caused him to pause just long enough to be thrown off balance. Something collided with James, throwing him into the dirt. I scrambled away as he began fighting a dark-colored wolf with blood-red eyes. James screamed and the sound soon morphed into a snarl. The man and the beast fought one another, tumbling across the dirt and splintered trees. I looked away only for a moment, just long enough to find where the gun had been thrown. The minute I saw it shining on the ground, I dove for its protection. Before I could grab it, someone else landed in the dirt next to me. I looked up just in time to see Raven bearing down on me, kicking my arms away so she could reach the gun. As she went to grab it, I twisted her legs and pulled her toward me, fighting to keep her away. We tore at each other, limbs battling for control as our bodies tumbled across the forest floor. Our heads hit the ground hard, ricocheting off fallen trees and sharp rocks. I pushed Raven into stone as we careened into a small ditch littered with rocks. When her body crumpled, I leaped off her and stood, ready to run for the gun. As soon as I left the ditch, my heart stopped and my feet followed. The gun was no longer in the air but grasped in someone's hand, pointed straight at me. Chapter 61. Making everything right. My breathing came out short and ragged. Around me, I could hear the sounds of James and the other wolf fighting. I could hear Raven climbing out of the ditch. The smell of smoke was thick in the air as the person standing before me advanced, gun in hand. My world came to a standstill just long enough for me to whisper one accusation. Bray. He shot me a frozen smile. His eyes were narrowed and stance-wide as he stalked toward me. Though I scurried away, I didn't get far. Arms that I now knew belonged to Raven wound themselves around me, holding me in place. I didn't bother fighting her off. My attention was still focused on the man in front of me who was holding my fate in his hands. Bray tilted his head and the gun followed. Didn't expect to see me here. You humans are terribly naive. His smile turned into a glare when a loud snarl sounded. James had shifted into a wolf, and now had the other pinned to the ground, teeth hovering over his neck. They were both panting, and for just a moment, the darker-colored wolf shifted his gaze to me. I saw Will's eyes within the beast, screaming at me to run, fight, or do anything to save myself. Raven's grip tightened. She locked my elbows and pushed my hands up, arching my back in a painful position. Mangled cries lingered in the back of my throat, a few escaping to pierce the silent night. After a moment, Bray turned his glare on me. You're not worth all this trouble. Will's wolf sprang forward, getting another few gashes in on James before he was pinned down again. Peyton watched the encounter with tangible fury. And you, Bray turned to James Wolf, hovering over my brother. You can't do anything right. Always with the extravagancies. Always with the games. Never able to deliver. While keeping his gaze trained on the pair of wolves, Bray began a slow walk toward me. Raven tensed and pulled me closer to her body, sending a spasm of pain throughout my limbs. I struggled in her grasp, but there was no fighting her strength. Soon enough, Peyton was standing before me, too close for comfort. He towered over my frame. When our chests were only inches apart, his gaze darted back to Raven and he smiled. She held me steady, long enough for Peyton to tilt his head and regard my shaking frame. How nice it is to have friends who have your back, isn't it, Samantha? Bray sneered and paused before his light eyes flickered to Raven. Despite my best judgment, you came through, Raven. I have to say I am surprised. Though I think I am not the only one. His smile grew wider, enhancing the glaciers supporting his expression. Tell me, Samantha, did you truly think it would be this easy, that everything you did simply worked in your favor? Or are you as stupid as Ravens told me? My heart fell out of my chest, and despite my best efforts, my gaze fell to the floor. Tears of betrayal stung more than just my eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn around and curse Raven for ever letting me believe I could trust her kindness. That's what I thought, Bray continued. What the hell do you want? I spat out, interrupting his monologue. Why do you even care about me? About her? Oh, I don't, he mocked. This is not about you. You're just caught in the crossfire. Peyton lifted the gun to my head, letting the barrel rest against my temple. My neck tensed as I drew in a quick breath. If this isn't about me, then let us go. We just want to leave without any troubles. I paused, trying to gain control of my trembling voice. If not me, then let Will go. He doesn't have to be a part of this. That's where you're wrong once more. He'll be coming back with me. My shoulders stiffened, pulling against Raven's grip. I don't understand. I know. He took the gun away from my temple to pat the top of my head, shifting his eyes to Raven. Do not screw this up now. One of Raven's hands stretched forward, and Bray placed the gun in her palm. Without hesitation, she brought the barrel to my head. While this was happening, Bray backed away and began a purposeful walk toward the two wolves. He picked up a bundle of fabric on his way over, tossing the clothes next to James when he got close enough. Without another word, James retreated from Will. The minute Will tried to jump up from the ground, Peyton came around and kicked his head to the side. A terrified scream left my lips as his body went limp. James appeared moments later, glaring at Bray. I had it under control. Peyton's expression darkened and his voice turned sinister. I could hear this encounter from miles away. You should consider yourself lucky I was the only one. And this. He nudged Will's snout with his foot. There is no ounce of control in this situation. You didn't let me finish. Bray moved faster than my eyes could follow. He was chest to chest with James in an instant, growling his words. I shouldn't have had to let you do anything. It was supposed to be taken care of. James took a deep breath but stepped down. His chest fell and he shuffled backward. Peyton seemed to grow taller with the distance put between them. Instead of having to face Bray, James turned to glare at me. He looked me up and down, eyes lingering on the blood coating my body. With just one glance, I felt symphonies of fire erupt from every wound. Without taking his eyes off of me, James spoke to Peyton. You have the boy. Let me finish her. Let me finish the deal. You know I can, or else you wouldn't have come to me in the first place. No. Bray placed himself between me and James. I came to you because you were my last resort. Now that I'm here, I will finish things the correct way. He paused, taking a deadly step forward. I do not give second chances. The entire forest stilled with the implication of Peyton's words. The gun grew heavier against my head. James cowered and shuffled several feet away. Not a breath of air passed into anyone's lungs. Then James stopped moving. A strange expression fell upon his face. He glanced at everyone in the clearing, muscles tensing with his intentions. Then he charged. He leaped over Bray and shot toward me and Raven. I screamed as I was pushed forward just in time for Raven to dodge James' attack. However, she was not his target, and the minute my knees hit the dirt, the top half of my body slammed to the ground. James pulled back as he propelled over me, his momentum overtaking his control. As I sunk into the ground, he flew to the side, skidding to a halt on his knees. His body began to morph as bones cracked and an enraged howl left his lips. From the corner of my eye, I could see Raven taking small steps toward Bray, the gun hanging limply at her side. An expression of pure rage had befallen Peyton, but he made no move to stop James' assault. I felt him coming before I saw anything. Without waiting for an impact, I sprang from the floor and dove for Raven's arms. Her screams echoed my own and she jumped away, stumbling as I latched onto her ankles. She fell to the ground and the gun clattered next to her. The minute I reached for the metal, something sunk into my leg. I screamed in agony and my hands dug into the dirt. Despite the pain, I scoured the floor for my saving grace, letting James' teeth dig deeper into my flesh. My legs kicked and flailed, ignoring the tremendous pain springing from every limb of my body. By the time my hands grasped the gun, I knew that when I looked down my legs would be no more. James dragged me toward him with his teeth. He was no longer a man, but a snarling beast ripping at any piece of me he could find. As he tore at my body, I forced myself onto my back. When the gun was steady, I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. Again and again and again. The gunshots rang louder than my screams. Following its deafening echo was nothing more than a soft whisper of wind. The claws and teeth ripping away at me had ceased. A heavy weight had fallen upon the bottom half of my body. I was left panting, struggling for air amidst smoke and terror. And here I was, thinking you didn't have it in you. Peyton's voice was the thing that finally broke the silence. It was thick and dark, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I understand your desire to kill him. He was much too impulsive for me. I was going to do it myself after this ordeal was finished. Though my vision was dancing with black dots, Bray came into focus standing next to me. My hands whipped to where he lingered, pointing the gun to his head. When I pulled the trigger, though, nothing happened. He came closer. My finger frantically pulled again and again, shaking the gun to work. When he was close enough, Bray kicked the metal out of my grasp and crouched beside me. You should have saved a few bullets. Tears sprang from my eyes as panic began to ease into space where adrenaline escaped. I kicked at the dead weight upon my legs, But I was stuck underneath James Wolf's carcass. There was no escaping. There was no running. And now there was no fighting. I wish I could say I regret everything, Bray mused, a cold overtone hanging on every word he spoke. But I don't. Everything happened exactly as I planned. At first I thought you might be an annoyance to what was to come, but here you are, making everything right. My mind was running on the last of its strength. Words tumbled out of my mouth before I knew what I was saying. It was a last desperate attempt to find some way to save my life. This isn't right, I panted, continuing my fight to push James off my body. None of this is right. You don't have to do this. On the contrary, this was how it was always supposed to be. I don't understand. My words were the loudest scream I'd cried yet. The words echoed through the trees, my panic traveling with them. Peyton growled and eyes the forest. He caught sight of Raven standing motionless on the tree line. Without another glance my way, he stood and stalked over to her. Retrieve the boy. Raven stumbled over her feet, meeting my wide eyes for the first time that night. Her gaze paused on my broken body for only a moment. Are we leaving her? Bray stopped dead in his tracks. He eased his body back to face Raven, rage lining his expression. Are you questioning me? I know, she stuttered. If you chose to do so, then my end of the bargain will expire as well. Is that what you're doing? Raven stumbled toward Bray, clasping her hands in front of her. No, please, I'm not. He sent her a cold glare, quieting her words. Retrieve the boy. Raven disappeared from my sight. Bray turned back to me, a cool expression having replaced his earlier fury. Something long was glinting in his hands, and as he stepped toward me, I knew the end was near. I could already see his knife dripping with my blood. When he crouched beside me again, it wasn't a surprise to feel the sharp end cut into my throat. Thank you for allowing me to set things right, Samantha. For that, I will make this quick. He pushed the knife deeper into my skin. A scream echoed through the night, though after a moment, I realized it was not my own. Bray's knife was held stagnant against my neck as he whipped his gaze back to where Raven disappeared. When her cries sounded again, he dropped the blade and disappeared. I was left on the forest floor bleeding out as the world around me came to life. Raven's cries of pain continued, but they were now partnered with inhuman howls of violence. In their midst I heard another creature, but they soon all blended together in my clouded mind. My legs were abruptly freed from the crushing weight of James Wolf. It took me a moment to realize this, and when I did, it took another few for my mind to focus. Another dark-colored wolf was hovering over me, watching me with a careful expression. It was not holding me down though, rather protecting me from what lay beyond. The wolf shifted his weight, glancing at the rest of the forest, then back to me with worried eyes. They were dark brown, matching the color of its fur, and the appearance of my brother. Just as I realized this, he whipped his head forward, muscles tensing. I eased up onto my elbows and lifted my head to gaze around Will's large wolf. Every movement took every ounce of strength I had left, but I kept on moving. After a long time I was kneeling, clutching Will's back leg for support. When I raised my gaze, I saw that Bray was watching my every move with narrowed eyes. His hands were bloody and outstretched. Behind him was carnage. Tree limbs were shattered, littering the forest floor. Every inch of ground held claw marks. Raven's body was limp on the floor. You know you can't overpower me, Bray growled. You can't even shift out of your uncontrollable wolf. My fingers twisted in Will's coarse fur. He snarled at Bray's remark, shifting his weight from side to side. I need you alive, Bray continued, but that does not mean I need you in one piece. His face began to morph and bloodied hands cracked into paws. In another moment Bray was gone, and a black wolf was in his place. It blended in with the night, seemingly disappearing within the shadows of the trees. Will was the first to move. He lunged forward and began a gruesome battle with Bray. They tore at one another, fighting for dominance in their lives. When the wolves drew nearer to me, I gathered my senses and strength and stood. I stumbled out of the way just as the two wolves crashed into the spot I lay moments before. Without waiting for them to collide with me again, I continued forward into the trees and away from the battle. They continued tearing at each other behind me as I drew nearer to the carnage of the forest where Will's once lifeless body laid. In almost the exact same spot was Raven. As I drew near to her, I noticed the blood pooling around her body. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as if each breath was a great struggle. My legs gave out as I fell by her side, and her wide eyes bore into me. Her lips moved with phantom words and whispers that I was never able to hear. As if sensing my lack of understanding, Raven raised a shaking hand. Her mouth continued to move as she pointed a finger into the forest. Her hand, though trembling beyond control, never wavered in its direction. My gaze followed where she gestured, but the only thing I could see was trees. When I looked back into her eyes, she was staring at me with an urgent expression. I flicked my gaze back and forth between her and the forest, before finally making a decision to follow her command. Though I realized I didn't know Raven like I thought I had, I did know that she knew me. She knew I would never leave my brother, even if it meant I would die. She knew I would fight until that last moment. She knew I would always look for a way out, even if that way was stupid and reckless. So when she pointed into a seemingly tree-congested part of a forest, I knew she wasn't indicating for me to run. I knew there was something more just beyond the treeline. I stumbled to my feet and ran. My hands clutched passing trees for support as my body threatened to give out under the weight of my injuries. Soon my vision danced with black spots and I grew lightheaded. Still I ran. There had to be something there. There had to be something Raven was pointing me to. This couldn't be the end. Chapter 62 A Disgrace. I broke through the treeline and fell into a meadow. The grass went up to my knees and the moon cast a harsh light upon it. A small patch of water pooled near the treeline with rocks glistening around the edges. Shadows stretched from the center of the clearing, leading to a small truck that sat parked on the grass. A triumphant smile graced my lips and for several moments, I thought I was hallucinating. Only when I staggered to the door and threw myself inside did I believe that what I was experiencing was real. My hands ran along the steering wheel as I sunk into the carpeted seats. Blood soaked into the cloth and dripped onto the floor, and for a moment, the weight of my injuries threatened to overwhelm me. I stared at the blood as more and more of it escaped my body, entranced by how much was running down my legs. Then I shook my head. That moment passed, and I was shifting the car into gear. Once the car had started, I let out a cry of victory. It was short-lived because as soon as the sound escaped, my thoughts caught up to me. I couldn't drive back to Will. There was no path. I couldn't leave him because there was no guarantee he would survive long enough for me to get help. Here I was on the verge of turning the tides and surviving, but at an utter loss as to what I could do to make it happen. My hands hovered over the steering wheel, my feet rested on the pedals. There was a small path leading out of the meadow that I knew would take me away from here, away from Bray, away from the danger, but also away from Will. I scanned the trees once again, hesitating for a small moment. That moment was cut short when a figure in the side of my vision emerged from the trees. It was a wolf unlike any I'd ever seen, lingering just behind the entrance of the meadow. Its fur was gray with white-tipped ears and eyes black as the sky. We stared at each other as another identical wolf emerged, stopping next to the first. The second tilted its head and narrowed its eyes, taking a small step toward me. My heart leaped into my throat as a scream threatened to erupt. As my panic grew, the scene around me shifted. Trees on the other side of the clearing snapped in half as two more wolves came crashing into the grass. They stumbled over one another, biting, clawing, and drawing as much blood as they could manage. When their frenzied attacks paused long enough for me to search their eyes, I recognized Bray standing tall with a wounded Will cringing before him. Will's wolf limped away as Bray stalked forward. His attack was slow and calculated, whereas Will was struggling for survival. When he tripped over his limbs and Bray drew back to lunge, I didn't hesitate. I ignored the foreign wolves and went straight to the threat. My feet floored the gas pedal and the car lurched toward Peyton Bray. The horn blared as I tried to warn Will away. He looked back just in time to yelp and dive to the side, stumbling out of the car's reach. Bray had more time to react and was turning away before I came close to running into him. I didn't let that deter me. When I reached the edge of the meadow, I whipped around and barreled straight for the black wolf. Once more, mud and grass flew as the tires fought for traction. When the car was facing Bray again, he was standing stationary at the other end of the clearing, staring at me with determination. My face twisted into a scowl as I slammed down on the pedal and barreled forward. Bray matched the movements of the car, running at top speed. He kept his eyes trained on me as his feet flew across the grass. The distance between us grew rapidly smaller. The moment I braced myself to crush him, Bray let out a harrowing snarl. He leaped toward the truck and flew through the air, aiming his massive body straight for the windshield. I didn't have time to scream. My hands flew to protect my face as I watched the black wolf soar through the air. Time came to a standstill. My feet slammed on the brakes. I closed my eyes and tensed for shards of glass to cut through my skin and end my life. Bray would heal from the impact, but I would not. Another sound engulfed my ears, threatening to bring me back to the present. It was a different wolf howling to the moon. The noise struck my heart in more than one way and forced me to open my eyes to find the source. I didn't have to wait long. With a flash of blonde, Bray's wolf was knocked from the sky. He fell to the ground several feet away, as the other wolf barreled over him. Red eyes flashed in the dark clearing, drawing my attention away for a moment too long. The car flew forward, racing for the trees. The tires worked for traction as my hands flew to the steering wheel. The world twisted around me as my body ricocheted off the seats. When the car finally came to a halt, my body continued swaying back and forth, my head spinning. My fingers fumbled for the door handle, and in a daze I stumbled out of the car. I fell to the ground, grasping at the blades of grass. My vision swam, but when I looked up, I focused long enough to see the fight was only escalating. Two wolves were circling each other, though Will was no longer in this battle. Bray paced on heavy feet as he stared at his new opponent, searching for weaknesses and planning an attack. The other wolf watched Bray with a calm yet sharp demeanor. His blonde fur rippled with anticipation. Samuel was back. Bray lunged, but Samuel didn't hesitate. He dodged the attack and sunk his teeth into the other wolf. Bray's composure faltered, leaving Samuel to gnash and tear at every piece of flesh he could find. By the time Bray was released, he was limping and beginning a retreat. A low howl cut through the night, gaining the attention of all in the clearing. Will was staggering toward me but had collapsed next to the water which separated us. Bray took advantage of the distraction and dove toward Will, but Samuel anticipated his movements. He caught the black wolf by the back legs, pulling him back into the fight. Bray twisted around and leaped onto Samuel's back, ripping into the skin between his shoulders. The blonde wolf snarled, throwing Bray toward the trees and stalking toward him once more. I tore my focus away from the fight and crawled around the rocks until I was next to Will. His head was hanging halfway in the water, and he was unable to pull himself away. He sunk into the mud and his eyes were clouding over. The breaths he was able to take were shallow and labored, and his tail flicked with anxiety. I lowered myself down next to him, pulling his head into my lap. Will turned to look at me, eyes shining with unspoken words. My hand smoothed over his face, flattening the fur matted with blood and grime. "Stay with me," I mumbled, my eyes scanning his body. There was a large gash running along his back, another along his belly. Blood covered nearly every inch of his fur. "You'll be okay," I told him, holding back a sob. Will whimpered, pushing his snout into my hand. Tears fell from my eyes as I laid my forehead between his ears. The battle of the other wolves was still raging, growing more violent by the second. Their snarls pulled my attention away from Will, who was already watching them with wary eyes. The blonde wolf's fur was stained crimson, but the black wolf was beginning to weaken. Just as Samuel's wolf prepared to lunge again, his attention cut to the edge of the clearing. One by one, figures began to emerge from the trees. Some I recognized. Others were strangers. They all seemed to recognize Samuel and Bray, though. Their gazes were fixed upon them, each horror-filled and confused. As they drew closer, Samuel stepped away from Bray and closer to them. The cracking of bones echoed through the meadow, and after a few moments Samuel stood tall. He threw a bundle of cloth at Bray's retreating wolf, moving back around to face him. When Bray was a man again, the meadow was silent. I could hear his heavy breathing even from where I sat, feel his cold glare on each and every one in the vicinity who dared to disrupt his evening. Finally he spoke. He turned his gaze to Samuel, eyes ablaze with rage. "Have you called in your reinforcements to finish me off?" Samuel rolled his shoulders, glancing around. He kept his back toward me, and I found myself wishing I could be by his side. As if in answer, his head tilted toward me and I saw the side of his expression. His eyes were hard, his jaw set firm. He shook his head so slightly that I would have missed it had I not been staring. Then he squared his frame and regarded Bray. When he spoke, his words were harsh and met the temperature of Peyton's glare. This is the last of the pack who was celebrating their fallen ones' lives. We all heard a fight and came to investigate. He spat his next words. Seems we arrived just in time for you to kill my mate. How convenient, Peyton panted, sneering his words. But you have it wrong. It was your human who was killing me. Samuel took a step forward. I think you're mistaken. Am I? Peyton straightened his spine. Go and see the two others she already killed. There was a beat. Then Samuel responded through his teeth. What are you doing here? I was coming back from patrol when I found your mate at the border. We are far from the border, Bray. Perhaps that is because she crashed a car and killed 2 wolves when I attempted to speak with her. The silence that surrounded us was thick, stretching further than even the moon could reach. There was no mistaking the horror-filled expressions flinching my way, accusing me of the things Bray spoke. My heartbeat was the loudest thing of the night, pounding hard enough to deafen anyone within the meadow. Bray smiled. I found her driving a car through the border. She was in perfect health. No bite. No adverse reaction to your werewolf gene taking over her pathetic human life. He turned toward those gathering around Samuel and raised his voice. When I found her, she was running away, gathering the rest of the humans to kill our pack. Samuel lied. He never bit her. He let her run off, only for her to come back to kill us all. And now that I've discovered his plan, Samuel is here to kill me. That's not true. Samuel shouted. Where's your evidence? Peyton sneered. She killed them. No. I shouted, gathering the attention of everyone in the clearing. The words had left my mouth in such a rush, I hadn't considered their implications. Now I had a band of angry wolves glaring down at me. I regarded them all for a moment, before letting my gaze shift to Samuel. He was staring at me with a tense expression, his frame clouded with stress. I took a deep breath. We were attacked. By you and James. My gaze shifted to Bray, who held a distant expression. Why would I set out to kill a wolf, when I know that I would only die myself? Because you are human, Peyton answered. They have done it before. Look at what happened with our alpha. You were running away to gather others to finish the job. A tumultuous snarl left Samuel, and the attention was back on him. Do not lie. It was their guns that killed him. Bray roared. The humans' attack killed countless members of the pack. Samuel matched his volume. No, it was you. A momentary silence fell upon the clearing. It was heavy with Samuel's words and the memory of those who lost their lives that night. Everyone exchanged nervous glances, the crowd shuffling their feet back toward the trees. Samuel, breathing heavily, continued in a voice as calm as death. I've had you followed, Bray. From the moment Riley died, I knew it was you. You and your men. Bray's eyes narrowed. What evidence do you have? You had them killed. The attention of the clearing was turned again to the edge of the forest. Footsteps could be heard, and soon enough more people began to gather. Leading them was Goldie, with Marshall at her side. Samuel glanced at them, then turned a scowl back on Bray. I didn't know if we were being attacked again. Samuel spoke in an even tone, staring at Bray as others flooded the scene. I called in reinforcements. Peyton started at the individuals emerging from the forest. Goldie broke away from them to stand between the crowd and Samuel. Marshall scanned the meadow until his gaze fell upon me and Will, collapsed on the ground. He wasted no time in sprinting across the grass, closing the distance between us in seconds. He came to a halt kneeling next to us. With careful hands he began to assess my legs, but I pushed him away. Well, I told him, look at Will. Marshall didn't argue. He didn't even glance my way before shifting his attention to my brother. His hands moved along his body, pressing in various places. Will's breathing was shallow and harsh, but he laid still. You're lying even now, Samuel. Bray snarled, glaring at us. Tell them who that wolf is. Tell all of your people what he did. What she did. Tell everyone you called here what really happened, and what you've been hiding all along. The meadow was silent, waiting with bated breath. An unreadable mask had fallen upon Samuel's face, though I saw the endless tension lining his shoulders. He scanned the meadow, looking into the faces of every person gathered there, as he spoke in a firm voice. The wolf is Samantha's brother. He was turned unwillingly by one who was exiled. Tell them what happened the night the alpha died, Bray goaded. Samuel glared at him, his voice unwavering. Riley and I helped him through the shift. When it was almost over, Riley was distracted and got injured. Peyton began to speak, but Samuel raised his voice and spoke over his words. He would have been fine, had it not been for the gunfire headed by Bray. We were ambushed by what we initially thought to be a human attack. Upon a closer look, there was no way it was possible. All the guns were being held by Bray, the one in charge of security. I know your games, Samuel. Peyton smiled and shifted his feet. You are only distracting them from the actual proof. Why would I kill our alpha? I would not take his place. I would not want my pack in ruin. You, however, have only done that. You have lied from the beginning. You are not fit to run this pack and you never will be. The world stood still and somehow I knew what Bray was going to say next. Samuel suspected his words as well because his hands balled into fists and he tensed for the reaction we all knew was coming. Bray, Samuel tried. Peyton spoke over him, turning to the members of the pack. He was a human. It is why his mate is human, it is why he is weak, and it is why he can never be an alpha. The words sent daggers into the cold air. My heart left my body. Samuel's one secret was now out in the open, all because he had trusted me. In turn, I had taken that trust and used Samuel's secret as a way to selfishly convince Raven to escape with me. She hadn't hesitated in using that knowledge against us and betraying me. A stray female broke away from the crowd. She had dark maroon hair and wore a hopeful expression. Her gaze danced between Peyton and Samuel, faltering when she locked eyes with Samuel. That's not true. It's not true as is beta. Samuel wouldn't look up from the ground. Another few people stepped forward, asking Samuel the same question. When he refused to answer, Peyton smiled. He can never run this pack. It's not in his blood. He is a disgrace. Goldie stepped forward then, stopping only inches away from Bray. She leveled herself up to his chest, glaring daggers into his face. His composure never wavered. After a moment, she turned to those gathered but didn't step away from Bray. Her voice held the conviction of 1,000 testaments. Alpha Riley knew. She let her words sink in before continuing. He knew the entire time. He welcomed Samuel into our pack and wouldn't have anyone else be at his side. He didn't care. Bray suddenly moved forward, knocking Goldie off balance. She gained it back without hesitation, but Peyton was already on the move. He stalked towards Samuel, his expression growing deadlier with each step. It was supposed to be me. Before you showed up, it was my place. He was standing in front of Samuel now, breathing heavily. Now I'm taking it back. Samuel narrowed his eyes. Are you challenging me, Bray? There's nothing to challenge. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.